Welcome to the Corporate Venturing Insider Series. Today, I'm very happy to have Barbara Dalton from Pfizer Ventures joining us. Barbara, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me to join you this morning.
So, Barbara, as I always start, I like to ask the personal journey into corporate venturing.
Oh, that's been a long journey. I've been a corporate venture capitalist for over 30 years, so it's been a long journey. But getting there, I started my life as a research scientist and spent 10 years in academia, both working and completing my education. I have a PhD in immunology. And after finishing my PhD and looking to do a postdoc, I was interested in following the science that I had originally been involved in, and that was interferon. It was interferon biology long before it was cloned. And the labs that were doing that work were not located in my hometown of Philadelphia. But I was married, and my husband was married to a family business. And so my decision to leave academia and go into industry was determined for personal reasons. I decided to stay married, and was looking for a position within the Philadelphia area. SmithKline and French was a large Philadelphia-based pharmaceutical company, and they had an opening for a postdoc in their research organization. And so, because I decided not to take a postdoc in the UK, which I really wanted to do, I decided to stay for personal reasons. I think that's an important point. We make career decisions for personal reasons too. And I joined the pharmaceutical industry in the early 80s. In a research laboratory working in the interferon side of the business, and not the interferon, the inflammation immunology side of the business. Early days for what would become known as the JAK systems, the cytokine systems that drive inflammation. And I did that for about 10 years. One day I was on a train going to Baltimore. I always remember this day. I was on a train going to Baltimore with my boss, the head of the department, because we were looking to buy some collaboration in the chemistry area. And we were going to visit a company. And on that train, we bumped into a gentleman whose name was Peter Sears. At that point in time, Peter was head of the venture capital group at SmithKline. That venture capital group was called SR1. And so we had an introduction, we chatted, Peter got off the train, going to a board meeting, and we continued on to visit our company that we were looking for carbohydrate chemistry in. About a week later, I got a phone call from Peter who asked me if I would be willing to help them look at some companies, help them with the diligencing of companies in the immunology area. And I said, sure, I'm curious. As a scientist, I'm very curious. And I'd say, sure, I'd be glad to look at some companies and opine on the science. So I was helping the venture capital group due diligence for probably 2-3 years or something like that. When they had something that fell into my area, immunology, they'd give me a call and I'd take a meeting or review the slides and opine on, what my thoughts were. And I got to know the group. It was a very small group. And then in the early 90s, I decided, 20 years of laboratory work, it was time to move on and do something else. And so I started looking for other positions within then the SmithKline business side of the organization. And it's quite common for scientists to move into business development because we bring our scientific background with us to do the work of business development. And so I was looking at a position there, and it was I did not know the hiring manager. And so I was diligencing the hiring manager, calling around and saying, well, you know about this guy. And I happened to call my friends over at SR1. I actually called Brenda Gavin, famous woman in the corporate venture capital world, who has unfortunately passed away a few years ago. And she said, oh, I don't know him, but you don't want to go there. You want to come here. You want to come work with us. And I said, I do. She said, yeah, you don't want that job. You want to come here and work with us. And I'm going, okay. She says, I'm going to have Peter call you. Come in for an interview. And I'm going, all right. This is like one of those strange changes in life. And the outcome of that was I had a meeting with Peter. He explained to me at a very, very, very high level what venture capital was. While I had been doing diligence for them, I didn't go and research venture capital. I just did the science side of it. I never paid attention to the business side of it. And so, he said that we're expanding the group and we would like a scientist to join us. We have a business development professional, we have an accountant, we have a lawyer, we have a physician. We'd like a scientist to join us, and we've worked with you. And so, yeah, we'd like you to join the group. And I said, okay, I'll join the group, So one day I walked out of the lab and I walked into the venture capital group. Why? because I had made a connection in a network 3 years earlier, not because I was driving to get that job. I never thought about it, to be quite truthful. It was because I found it interesting. I'm always very curious about science and what's going on. And so that started my career. A random event of bumping into someone on a train to Baltimore, led into an introduction to the team, working with the team, and then eventually being hired by the team. After 10 years, I ended up running the group. We went through many changes and things like that and became GlaxoSmithKline and those sorts of things. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. Just like when I transferred from the academic research environment into the pharmaceutical research environment, everybody said, oh, you're going to the dark side. I thoroughly enjoyed my move into the pharmaceutical industry. I really liked the focus of drug development. There was real end game there. You learned what experiments you didn't have to do. The ones you did, you focused on getting to the end game, as opposed to research where you can meander around and ask questions, open questions, which is really nice. And what in many cases the academic world does. But in the pharmaceutical industry, you are driven to the end game, which is identifying novel targets, identifying novel drugs. So I really enjoyed that switch. And now I had made the switch into venture capital as a member of a team. It was a very small team. I actually liked that too. I liked the small team that operated like a partnership more than, being one person in a 5,000 person R&D organization. And the other thing that I liked about it is you were responsible for yourself. You weren't dependent upon the organization being successful. You were responsible for the work that you did. Peter did an excellent job of offering his time to me to train me. He said, we will work together until you tell me to go away. He said, we will go to all the meetings, we will do everything. And he would throw business plans at me and, say, what do you think about this one? And then those days, business plans were actually documents, maybe 50, 60 pages long. Everybody was taught how to write a business plan in business school, and they wrote business plans, and you sat down and you read them. And you've quickly developed a way to review them, which was first go look at the people, find out who the people are. And I remember one of the first business plans that Peter gave me to read. The first thing when I read it from cover to cover. Of course, you're a beginner, you don't know what to focus on. And when I got to the people that were involved, there was a group of strange people involved with this company. People who had no knowledge or no background in the science area, but who had name recognition. If I mentioned their names today, everybody would recognize them because one was an opera singer and the other was a general in our government too. So it was like, what are they doing there, et cetera. And it was the sort of thing where Peter said, yep, we pass on that one, that sort of a thing. So learning by doing. I believe it takes a couple years, 3 years or so to really learn the venture capital world. So I was a corporate venture capitalist for SR1 for 10 years. At the end of those 10 years, there were some decisions made in the corporation post-merger. They couldn't decide whether they were going to go forward with SR1. Fortunately, they did. But the majority of us in SR1 decided to go to the private fund, which we had created during our time at SmithKline, particularly during the bubble, because it allowed us to tap other sources of money to make investments. The Glaxo organization didn't like that, and so we separated ways. And it was there that I received a phone call at one point in time, a couple years later, from a headhunter who was looking for someone to lead Pfizer's ventures. Now, I didn't know Pfizer at all. I knew that they were New York based, which is not too far from Philadelphia, my hometown. And, they were looking for someone to lead the group. And I thought, well, I 10 years in one corporation. I ended up leading the group before I left. I pretty much know what all the issues are going to be from a corporate perspective, because they're fairly common in the corporate venture capital world. We all suffer or benefit from the same issues. And so I said, yeah, sure, I can do this. This is something new and interesting. And it was also, let's come back to the personal. It was also at a point in my personal life where my daughter was going to college. And so it was okay, I don't have to be home as much anymore. And, I could spend, 3 to 4 days a week in New York. And so that's when I started at my current job, which was leading the Pfizer Venture Group. And that was 16 years ago. And so I've had 2 major stints in 2 different corporations in the pharmaceutical business in working in, running, and managing corporate venture capital organizations. And it's a circuitous path. I say that I'm a accidental tourist in my career, because if you think about it, I'm very old, so let's put that out on the table. When I graduated college, there is no way I could have said, I want to be a venture capitalist investing in the biotechnology community for a pharmaceutical company. You couldn't say that back then because the biotech community didn't exist and venture capital was barely, it was mainly in its infancy, at that point in time. So the learning I take from that is make sure that you're prepared for whatever comes in the future because you don't know what it's going to be. I've certainly, my career has sort of paralleled time-wise the biotech industry. If you think about, was it Genentech's IPO in the end of the 70s, and I got my PhD at the beginning of the 80s, et cetera. So I entered the business world at the time, at the very beginnings of the biotech industry, and which was started by venture capitalists, obviously, and has only grown since then too. But it's been interesting that nowadays kids graduate, go to college, and say, "I want to be a biotech venture capitalist." Couldn't do that when I started, but it's the whole thing is be prepared for what's out there and be curious. I think that's the most important thing.
Actually, I think that's the golden nugget from your story, which is curious and being open. And even I think you're very humble about the meeting in the train. There's no doubt that during that conversation, you must have shown interest, passion about the topic enough that you would get the call a week later. But also, I think it's also not luck that you got the call from the headhunter to say, no, you should come and apply, because you had spent 2 to 3 years bringing value without ulterior motive. You were genuinely giving value. So maybe you can speak to that. How important is it to bring value before you even have a goal?
You need to clarify a little bit more to bring value. Well, I think that's always progressing your career. For example, I could bring to the table at Pfizer my experience that I had before. So it's a toolbox. I consider it a toolbox. What tools do you have in your toolbox? That's how you're referring to value. What had you learned, to get there? What had you done? What did you understand? It's very interesting. I'm a biotech investor, which is science-driven. Drugs, for the most part, we focus on drugs. We do some other things, but for the most part, we focus on drug development. And it's very different than other types of venture capital who focus on businesses who have products and are going to market and things like that. And so basically, you have to be very much, I think you have to have a greater understanding of the details, the scientific details in the work that we do. So my first value that I bring to the table is as a scientist, or as a former scientist, to be quite truthful, as a scientist who also received training, not only in the classic academic environment, which focuses you down very narrow, but also in the pharmaceutical research environment, which broadened my background. So I took my scientific background and I broadened it. I learned the business on the job doing it from that perspective, after 10 years of making venture investments and, working with companies, et cetera, I had learned that aspect of the business. And I got to understand the pharmaceutical industry and to some extent how it operates, although it still surprises me to today. But I think it was the total package that was put together, the tools that were put in the toolbox. But I didn't have that overriding, that's where I'm going type thing. Yep. It was just, I collected good tools. I collected scientific training. I collected some pharmaceutical knowledge. I collected management training, et cetera. It's very different. A lot of people, venture capital in its purest form is a financial function. And a lot of people with financial backgrounds sort of say, well, I can do that. I'm good in finance and all that sort of stuff. And maybe you can in other disciplines, but in the biotech space, you better have some knowledge about the science and what's going on there too. So, purely bringing a financial perspective to venture capital may work in some areas, but in my science-driven area, it doesn't. Our companies are basically big research projects. Everybody thinks one of the questions I get asked, well, how could you be a scientist and then move into this business thing? I said,
that was my next question.
They're research projects. They're run on budgets that are expense budgets. So I don't have to worry about, a financial accounting for revenues, financial accounting for software, all that sort of technical financial stuff. I guess, I could do it if I needed to, but in a biotech company, you don't need to have that background. You need to have a stronger background around the science. Yes, you have to pack it in with some business aspects, managing companies, managing businesses, compensation, option pools, the legal documents for the investments. Mm-hmm. But the reality of it is these businesses are research projects with expense budgets. So anybody who's managed a household budget, knows that so much comes in and it gets spent and there's nothing left and nothing else comes in. You can't do what you normally did. So it was simple. The business aspects of it, probably the more detailed aspect of it, were the legal documents that govern our investments. That is something that, you read several times and you go bleary-eyed and it puts you to sleep. But eventually you figure out what are the points you need to focus on. And you don't end up reading every word, and you know what to focus on, and you have this list of things that you go through and tick, and you work with really good lawyers too. That helps. But I'm the type of scientist who, in the beginning, I read every single legal document I had. And I don't think I understood it all in the beginning, but eventually it comes.
And would you say, because I can see the value of a PhD, which is really you go very deep into a topic, you build convictions from first principle, then you have to argue it with other peers who will challenge you.
Yeah.
As an investor, this really is valuable skill set. Could you speak to this discipline?
Well, I think it's what I think it is I think it's the feeling comfortable with being questioned and questioning. I am described as very blunt and straightforward. And I'm also described as you always have a question. Well, that's because I have so much more to learn. I mean, there's so much out there to learn. And I only ask questions if I don't know something. I don't play games with asking questions and things like that. But it was that interrogation, be it on either side of the table. So if I'm interrogating a company about what they're doing and they're not responding the right way or the way you would expect someone who should be knowledgeable in this space to respond, it's, a little bit of a red flag too. And then if they come to the table and they don't ask questions of me as representing an investment group, or anybody in the team as an investment group, they haven't done their homework either. Years ago, we're called Pfizer Ventures. So you know who we are, you know who we represent. But years ago, when I was at SR1, it didn't say SmithKline. It was actually, for those of you who don't know, and I think many of you do know, but it was named after the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia, where SmithKline was located. And it was a mimic on Charles River Funds in Boston, because Charles River Funds had been around for quite some time. And we rapidly needed a name for this group at one point in time. We said, okay, it's Schuylkill River. And the lawyer said, no one can spell Schuylkill, so call it SR1. But with a name like that, you don't bring with you the corporation that you're representing. So there would be people who would companies that would come and pitch to us and have no clue that we represented, the pharmaceutical company SmithKline, or later on GlaxoSmithKline. And that to me was also a big red flag. You weren't ready, to be in the room with people. You hadn't done your homework, when it came down to it. So I think the discipline, the way science is done, allows you also to be able to jump from one subject to another. So in the venture capital world, my scientific knowledge went from being very deep to being very narrow, but very broad. But some of the basic questions are similar, particularly in the drug discovery part. So it allows me to ask semi-intelligent questions in areas I don't know very well.
And I think, I want to touch about diversity of thoughts, because you mentioned the teams you joined was a very small team, but everyone was different backgrounds. Mm-hmm. Can you share maybe some of the learnings from having the small team, but very diverse backgrounds, and how it helps with decision making?
Yeah, I actually think it's a wonderful situation. So it's a wonderful situation if you're the individual, like if you're the physician, you get to answer all the physician questions and nobody can argue with you because you're this expert in that area, right? So that's a very good position. But you get the perspective of people with deep knowledge in different perspectives. It's like a 360 view, right? So it's a 360 view of the investment you're looking at. And most partnerships that are well run with the team of investors basically opining on the deal or the company you're looking at together. So if I found a company that I felt was interesting, I bring it to the table and we had partnership meetings. There's a standard in the industry, which I don't know whether everybody follows, but I continue to follow it, is team meetings on Mondays. That's what I call the partnership meeting. We do the same. We don't have a partnership in Pfizer Ventures, but I manage it like a partnership. We all come together, you all hear, you all get to basically poke, and question the ideas. But I think having people with diverse backgrounds, particularly when you're building businesses, so think about the business you're building. It's dependent upon science, yes. It's dependent upon people, yes. It's dependent upon finance and accounting, yes. It's dependent upon legal too. And if you're in the drug development business, it's dependent upon human health, et cetera. So no one person brings all of that to the table, although many may say they do. No one person brings that all to the table. And I have always felt that 3 brains are better than 1, when it comes down to it. And I am limited, in my knowledge base, and I would never pretend to be the be all and know it all for this. So I do like diverse groups, I like small groups, I like diverse groups, and I like everybody to bring something to the table, something a little different to the table. So when building a group, the way I guess Peter built SR1 in the beginning when he started it was to say, we want people in these different disciplines too. And I think it works really well. And I can learn from them. I can go to the finance guy and say, explain this waterfall to me. I can go to the lawyer and say, why did we put this in our terms, et cetera, things like that. So it's a great learning environment, but it also, I think it makes you better investors when you have diversity.
And I think it goes hand in hand with what you said earlier about being curious and open.
Well, I also, I've been in I don't change jobs frequently, as you can tell. I'm not a 2-year here, 2-year there person, because as long as I'm enjoying what I'm doing and everything else is fine, I'm very happy. I love doing what I do because I learn constantly. I am exposed to novel, new technologies. I'm exposed to new science, et cetera. The people who come in and pitch to us or in the very early days, you'd see a lot of companies, you don't invest in them all. I'm learning every time that occurs, and I am not sleeping during those meetings, and I am not, bored. I am sitting there taking notes and asking questions because I can take away something from any meeting that I have. And if I'm going to spend the time there, I'm going to make sure I take away something from it. Now, I may not invest in that company, but I may learn something different too. And I can remember sitting in meetings and like having my socks knocked off. It's like, whoa, you can do that? Really? Et cetera. And that's great. That to me, that basically keeps the old scientist inside of me, the curious scientist inside of me, alive. Let's put it that way. I really very much enjoy that aspect of it. The tougher side of things, not usually the finance side, it's the people side of things. That's the tougher side of things. That's when, it's like, the emotional side, et cetera, having to manage, companies that are going through turmoil or hire and fire management and things like that. That's the really tough side of it. Science is hard and we fail in the science, but maybe I'm more accepting of failure on the science side because, drug development, we fail most of the things we start, to be quite truthful.
Yeah.
But, the people side of it is the tougher side and the most important part of the investments we make.
It's also probably the less predictable. Like you said, it's the science part. You have a predictability of failure. The human side, you tend to be on the optimistic side when you invest.
Yes, you are. I think that's a human nature thing. I don't think we go into most of these, and their relationships, and in my world, our investments are 5 to 8 years. So they're long-term relationships. And we go into most relationships thinking things are going to be good. We don't go into relationships and saying, oh, this is going to be terrible, because you wouldn't make the investment, right? When it comes down to it. So yeah, and then I think you're personally disappointed that one, either you made a bad choice, or secondly, you didn't see what was going on, or you were disappointed by another human being, which happens in life,
Talking about the human element, and this one is a tough one even for myself. If you see a very good project to invest in, but you're not getting along, but there's nothing wrong with a person, you just don't feel this connection. Do you follow your gut in terms of deciding to invest or not? How do you handle this where everything is green, but there's something that doesn't quite connect with a person?
It's a big red flag for me personally. But what I will do is a gut check with somebody else. Whether it's intuition, gut, whatever you want to call it, we do have these, sometimes hard to pinpoint senses of something strange here, something wrong here, et cetera, too. And I would very much listen to your gut when you're doing this. But the thing to do is to actually have what we call a sanity check with somebody else, saying, how do you feel about this person, or just say, I can't take this deal forward. Why don't you see if you could, because the science is so great, or the technology is so good, or if you're a corporate group, if this is something your corporation really, really is interested in, and if you think about it, this is one of the big differences between venture investing, I hope, for most corporations, and business development. Business development will do a transaction to license or acquire a product, a tool, a technology, regardless of the people around it, right? They will do their diligence around the product, the tool, or technology, and they will know the quality as best they can determine at the time they do the deal, the quality of it. And then they take it, either they bring it in or whatever, however they take it forward. But when we invest, we get the management team too. And we get the whole picture. Think about it. Your company may only be interested in one. If they're developing 3 products, may only be interested in one product, and the other products may be duds, or they may be the winners and the one your company is interested in is not. But we get the whole package. We get the company, we get the bad management, the good products, the bad products, And so our decision making is different than doing a decision as a corporate business development professional. Yeah. And I always say that I use science as opposed to technology, but superb science and technology in the hands of poor management will not go anywhere. But I'll tell you that sometimes mediocre science can go really, really far. Mediocre management. Sometimes you want the best management, and the mediocre science can make a success, but the best science and bad management won't go anywhere. So I'm very much influenced by the people, and it's the management mantra, management. I changed that to people, but it's very much the case. And if you look back at investments that you've made, you probably had information at the beginning before you made the investment that told you something was going to go wrong with the people, and you didn't listen to it. And if you've done that a couple times, you go, get smarter next time, too. So I actually, if it were only me and not a team and not a corporation, I would run for the hills. If my gut told me something wrong here, I don't care, best thing since sliced bread, I'd run for the hills. In my world, usually there's not just one company in a space. There's usually, I call them star clusters. They emerge, around a new technology, and there's 5, 6, 7 companies, and you try to choose one in there. There will be one in that technical space doing something, that's emerging, creating science that in the future will be valuable to my parent organization. And there will be one there that has a good management team that you don't have that negative gut reaction to. And I would say, when you have that reaction, I would go the other way. I just go the other way.
I think there is something counterintuitive, maybe useful for the audience to.
It's true for your co-investors too. It's not just the people in the company. It's your co-invest. It's the whole ecosystem that you're jumping into. And it's if you can't work with your co-investors, that's also a problem too. As much as it is a problem if you get a bad read on your management. So it's all about the people around trying to make this company a success, as investors, as employees, as support, lawyers, accountants, whatever the case. It's the whole package. Good people.
It's the whole package, and maybe what's not intuitive is you're going to stick with these co-investors and these entrepreneurs for 5-10 years, which means that you actually need to be comfortable with whichever direction they already think they are going to. Well, for M&A or business development, there is probably a very quick shortcut to say, you know what, it's actually the product, it's the technology, but if it doesn't work out, we can change the management, we can bring our own people, and therefore it may not be about, are we okay with these people for the next 5 to 10 years?
That's true. That's very true. That's very true. And I people equate it to marriages. Some marriages don't last 5 or 10 years, when it comes down to it. These are very close relationships. You're highly dependent upon each other. And so the decisions should be made very, very carefully. Now, we, at least in my group, we all come from science backgrounds and we're science driven. And one of the biggest things in educating and bringing on board new managers in venture capital groups who don't have the business experience but come with the pure science is to have them be comfortable with understanding that the science is not the leader here. I mean, it's good, it's important, it's a big piece of what you're doing, but there's beyond that, because some people, as they move immediately from the lab, are just looking at the science, just looking at the science, just looking at the science. I said, no, you've got to grow and look beyond the science. You want good science, yes, no doubt about it, but it's more than just the science. And that's a transition that scientists who move into the biotech, for example, investing space have to make, I think, in order to be successful in my own mind.
So I want to ask about recruitment and training of your team. But before that, there is one thing you mentioned about making mistakes and then going back. Could you share maybe some best practices about doing retrospectives, about decisions made on some investments and learning from that?
So I'm a senior person in my role. I have had years and years of experience, and I've seen a lot of what we call the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's very interesting in that I've had the pleasure of bringing forward a team of people who had no venture capital experience. And those Monday morning meetings become teaching moments. And I will actually say, teaching moment, let's go back.
You would?
Yeah, I would. I'll say something to be learned here, et cetera, particularly when we're talking about what's going on. What happens in partnership meetings is you look at new deals, but you also review your current portfolio, what's happening, what's going on. And, I personally, as sort of the educator, the trainer in the group, will actually pull out what we're actively working on and saying, this is an educating moment, too. This is something you need to learn from. See what happens, or it can be a good thing too. See how this moved forward. See how they were successful in creating a partnership. But this is an education moment. This is something to learn from. This event is something to learn from. So I think doing it immediately, when you're in the thick of it, really helps the partnership, which I truly try to create as a real partnership. And it's really interesting when the members of my team come back to me and say, "You told us to to look out for that." And I said, yeah, it's good. I'm glad you remembered it. I'm glad you remembered it too. But it's you use your past experiences, because I sound like, this concept of wise old people who tell you stories about the past. Well, I've become that person, whether it's wise or not, but I do tell a lot of stories about, I'll never forget when, or remember when, and this is what happened. And I do think we learn from those sorts of things. So I try to incorporate them into our team meetings. Sometimes it's quite, funny, or, not only educational, but, it's like the stories are great in some cases, too.
Actually, I think it's very important, because in venture capital, sometimes there's something that comes along that doesn't happen a lot, quite rarely. And so in our case, when we started TDK Ventures, we had Paul Holland, who was a GP for nearly 20 years at Foundation Capital, mentoring us.
Yeah.
And I remember there was times where we would see something and he would say, you know what, in the last 20 years, I've seen it 3 times. And that's what happened. There's no substitute to that than someone who's been through it.
Well, I will tell you, I fall in that category today on AI. and health tech, et cetera. 3 times around, et cetera. Is it really here now, et cetera, that sort of stuff. And everybody said every time around, yes, it's really here. Yes, this is it, et cetera. Okay, too. So yeah, but there is, in the world of technology advancement and development, there's a right time for things.
Yep.
And the problem is we don't know when that right time is. So in my world, the science world, the human genome, for example, this goes back several years, was a big thing. One, that we had the tools and technologies to do it, but secondly, that we could learn from it too. And I had a friend who unfortunately has passed away, who very early in his venture capital career backed a company that was going to sequence the human genome, and it failed. It was not the right time for it, et cetera. 4 years later, he was so smart. 4 years later, 5 years later, he came back in and backed another company that was going to achieve the same thing. And that one was extremely successful. It was not the right time 5 years earlier, or maybe not the right people, but I don't think it was the right time. I think there were technological advances too. But he had such knowledge and confidence that he could say, okay, that was a terrible failure, lost money, et cetera, but I can come back in 5 years later. Now, I'm a little bit more wary. Some of us, we lose money in a particular area, so I'm not going there again, et cetera. I think you have to mature in that view, because there is a right time for things, only we don't know when that right time is, And if you really truly think it's very valuable and it did fail 5 years ago, it may be the right time now, So don't be as narrow-minded as I can be some days.
And we have the same today with clean tech 1.0 10 years ago, clean tech 2.0, and it's about understanding what's different. Is there something fundamental that says why now is now?
Why now? You're right. Definitely.
Very
Although
nice.
there's always a different flavor to it too. It's interesting. It's interesting if you've been around. That points to another thing that I think is quite valuable. And I don't know how much people do this, but when I first got involved in what could be called AI, it was big data or something like that back in the, oh my God, when was that? Back in the 90s or something like that. I thought that this could be my own personal opinion was the pharmaceutical industry has tons of data, and boy, if we could use it, benefit from it, that would be really great. So I chose to attend one of the big data conferences, one of the major conferences too. And believe me, they were talking Greek as far as I was concerned. I didn't know anything, but I wander around and I listen to the conversations and I hear the applications, and I also look to see what other pharmaceutical companies are there. So is this on the edge of pharma getting involved and pharma looking at it, et cetera? There was a lot of astronomers there, a lot of astronomy and star mappers and stuff like that, in terms of the big, whoa, but that's not what I need it for, or looking at Newton Bayesian analysis was been around for a long time, but it became extremely popular then and things like that. And, I would sit in and just sit back and try to learn from these things. But it was not the right time, for our industry, to really, grab hold. And it took some time, it took some years, but I really like to find an area like that and sort of watch it. My good friend, Brenda Gavin, who encouraged me to come and take a job at SR1, she always was very interested in the obesity space. And she had files in her drawer that focused on the brain axis of obesity and the metabolic axis of obesity. And she said, someday this is going to be important. That was in the early 90s. And she would keep up to date with new emerging technologies, et cetera. Never made an investment in the space, but she knew her view was someday this is going to be right for investment. And it was an area she was passionate about. And so she was monitoring it, And I think that good venture capitalists do things like that too. It would seem to me that our times go faster. The time between discoveries is faster, everything's faster, et cetera. But if there's an area that you really think is going to benefit if you're a corporation, your company, et cetera, and things like that, monitor it, keep track of it,
So at TDK Ventures, we have this preparedness concept, which is let's make sure that we know exactly what we wish to invest in, what are the KPIs we are looking at. We may not find anyone yet, but when it comes across, we would be so ready so fast.
And do you get help from your internal organization, the product development, people like that say, boy, if we could do this, that would be great. This is what we would like to do. That to me is a very good dialogue with your parent organization, and one that we're not always that good at, to be quite truthful, in general, because we have a big job, outside of it. But I also like people, I gravitate towards the people in my organization who think that way. There are many people who are very smart and thinking about their own particular project, but those who think to the point where if that breaks, that's going to be really relevant for us. And so we should be watching it, et cetera. And so I like to team up with somebody internally from a science perspective to say, so maybe every 6 months we're bouncing back, potential, scientific publications or things we've heard, et cetera, but it's not right for prime time yet. And I think having those relationships with people who are in the front line of the science and technology in your parent organizations who think like that. Not everybody thinks like that. A lot of people are really heads down and doing what they need to do to advance the projects they're working on. But those who are the big thinkers, I really like to sit down, have a drink with big thinkers. That's always fun.
And it's part of the best parts of learning. So I want to talk about recruitment. How do you pick people to join your corporate VC, and how do you find them, and how do you motivate them?
That's very interesting. Probably find, train, and motivate would be the two. Remind me to come back to this. So I joined a group which was very small at Pfizer. It was 3 people. And at some point, I'll tell you about the hirings that I've done within the Pfizer organization.
Thank you.
And it was small, very small people. And then when someone left, I had to fill a spot. And it just so happened that someone I had worked with at SR1 and I had known for quite some time, who had the experience and knowledge could come, join us, hit the ground running. Similar background to me, scientist by training, pharmaceutical industry, et cetera. And so I recruited that person to join the team. That was Elaine Jones, to join the team. And so for a number of years, there was Elaine, Bill Burkoff, and myself, working. And then we had a remit to expand the group, and we needed to hire like 6 people because of some things the corporation was interested in having us do. One of those was because Pfizer was getting out of the neuroscience area. We were stopping all of our R&D in neuroscience, but there are people in high levels in the organization that felt it was important to keep an eye on that. Not like you were talking about an emerging area, but it's one, we can't do everything. Any one pharmaceutical company can't cover all the therapeutic areas, and we made a decision to stop research into neurosciences. And so the thought was, well, how do we keep touch with what's going on? Let's have the venture capital group continue to invest in that space. There was new headcount, new allocation of people, and let's have 25% of what you're doing go into neuroscience. So that made it simple. We needed some neuroscientists in the group. So part of that hiring was to hire scientists who could bring knowledge to us such that we could continue to make investments in the neuroscience space, especially when we were depleting the scientists who were neuroscientists internally. So you didn't have necessarily a group to go to help you. And then at the same time, we were expanding more broadly. The venture capital group is a small group in most cases in a very large organization. And you want to have as many networks and feelers into that organization as you possibly can have. I could have posted those roles at the time of expansion externally and brought in more people with experience. But we had 3 people, myself, Elaine, and Bill, who were extremely experienced in the venture capital world and felt that we could teach anyone to do our job as long as they brought something else to the table. And that was the science they brought, or the background they brought from within the Pfizer organization, who they knew, who they networked with, who they connected with, et cetera. I always wanted a chemist. As a biologist in the research side of things, you were only as good as the chemist you had, to be quite truthful, because we're ultimately a chemical focused company.
Well said.
And so, in that, I felt every one of our companies was doing something that involved chemistry. So I basically sort of did the Tinker Tailor candlestick maker type list and went through that list to determine, what sort of a phenotype I would like for the most part, and was definitely willing to bring on people who had not a clue about venture capital. And maybe it has to do with my background, having had someone also bring me on board, having not a clue about venture capital and helping me train up in the organization. But anyway, that was my approach, mainly because I wanted their networks into the Pfizer organization. I wanted their technical knowledge, et cetera. And so, we identified someone with an oncology background. We had 2 neuroscientists, we had a chemist, et cetera. We had someone who was working in structural biology. We also chose a person who had not only a science background, but also a consulting and strategic background, who had demonstrated an interest in what we did. This is the situation. Somebody who volunteered some time with us, had expressed an interest. And in this case, they were very much driving for, I would really like to work with this group. And that was okay, but that had gone on for a year or 2 before, et cetera. Got to know them, got to know, how good or, how well we thought of them. And so we hired people who brought something to the table that we didn't already have. My most recent hire was Irina Melenkova, who has a 20-year experience in our industry, large company, small company, CFO, venture capitalist, investment banking for 10 years. So she came in, hit the ground running, didn't have to train her how to do anything, when it came down to it. And she also had worked in a pharmaceutical company, a large corporation before, because I think some people who have never worked in a large corporation come in and are amazed positively and amazed negatively. It's like, you really operate like that? Really? Is that the most efficient way to do things? Et cetera. So, large corporations are different, and large corporations in the pharma industry are different than large corporations in the tech industry too. But they all bring something different to the table than small companies. So if you only have small company experience, you should probably get some large company experience too. You need both to be the best of both worlds. So I chose purposely to hire people who needed to be trained, and the 3 experienced people paired up with the new people and worked to bring them up to speed. We also did, I said we have these teaching moments, but we also did teach-ins. We had outside lawyers come in and go through term sheets. We had compensation experts come in and go through compensation structures. So anytime I could find somebody to come in and educate us about the business side of things, we did that. We did that formally. We did it informally. And they brought their networks to the table. And it's worked out extremely well. 5 years later, they're all card-carrying venture capitalists who know what they're doing, et cetera. Every now and then, something new will come up that they haven't dealt with. Right now, we're looking at doing a little bit of fund investing, and not everybody has invested in a fund. And so I've made sure that the members of the team who haven't had that experience, can get that experience. We're not big fund investors. Pfizer does 90% of their work as direct investing. Every now and then we find fairly unique funds that we want to work with. And so you need to understand that side of the LP and being an LP in a fund. So that was even 5 years after they've been card-carrying venture capitalists. Now they're learning about it from a different perspective. And so I share the wealth of throwing people into that who've never done it before.
I think your own experience, which is you had never any intentions to do venture capital, you were a scientist, then you learned everything from your peers, that allowed you not to have any filter for who you were going to recruit next.
Yeah, I guess maybe it did influence it. There are a lot of good people that we could have recruited. I think it's very hard in the corporate world to bring people from the private financial venture capital world into the corporate world, unless they've had some corporate experience in general before that, too. Some people like the stability of being a corporate venture capitalist outside of the fund, the lack of stability that one could argue that funds have, which I think a 10-year fund gives you pretty much stability. But anyway, I think that there's different reasons why people want to work with corporations and don't want to be in the private sector. But fund, and I would say at its heart, venture capital should be the same in a company as opposed to a private group. But you do have some sort of maybe guardrails, restrictions, limitations that your culture and environment in your corporation puts on you. And it varies from one corporation to the next. It's like, and so you learn in one environment, and depending upon whether you stay in that environment or you move away, it can be very different from one corporation to the next. Whereas the private venture capital world, well, I'm sure that every one of those funds are all like dysfunctional families, but anyway, they're all, but they're all based upon the same structure. The LPGP for the most part, some people are trying to invent new things always, but an LPGP structure with partners and things like that. And they're all standard and common. But in the corporate venture capital world, we're not all structured the same. In fact, 95% of us aren't structured like each other at all. So there's big differences. The other question you asked is how do you motivate them?
Yep.
Venture capital in itself is a very motivating function, and it has to do with continuing to be able to invest. Continue, and I think there's self motivation. There's team. In my case, I hope it's team motivation. We live and die based upon successes that each one of us has and failures that each one of us has. So I view a success, if you're a member of the team and you've had a major success, it's our success, et cetera. And if I've had a major failure, it's our failure, too, because we live or die based. And that's true of the private venture capital world, although some would argue it's not, but it is supposed to be true of the private venture capital world. So I think being successful, if you look at the time frame that I recently expanded the group in 2018, we were in wonderful bull market, went crazy, nuts. So the last year has been a bit more educational for that team, because now we're in a bad market, So you need to go through the cycles to really.
Is that your teaching moment?
Yes, they're teaching moments. Yes, they're teaching moments, too. Oh, why aren't these people coming into the rounds? All of a sudden, people are stepping away, not doing their pro rata pieces. I said, welcome to a down market. Welcome to different types of investors who came into the pure play venture capital world, and now they don't like it. They want to get out. They want liquidity faster than they can get it. But so I think that there is that. They also come with scientific backgrounds, so they have a bit of what I talked about in terms of being a scientist and always wanting to learn, and really like gee whiz science and stuff like that. And they're learning very, very hands-on about the people part of it. I still am learning that too. But I think it's the science that drives them. The successes, drive them too. We don't have a carried interest, structure. So it's not because we're financially successful for the corporation that they're making more money as a consequence of that. So they don't get that as a sort of positive, but I think they get a lot of other things that are positively motivating to them. And what was the final thing? It was motivation and something else.
And how do you select them?
Well,
I think you touched on it.
It had to do with background and information, at the time. The other thing is the most recent person that I hired who had all that experience. I had lost one of the members. Bill Burkhoff chose to leave, and so I had lost a member and Elaine retired, and here I am. I didn't have that core group of people with significant investment experience. And so in that case, I said, let's bring another person in with significant investing, financial experience, and that will help to bring something new to the team. And Irina, does teach-ins about how investment bankers think about things, and stuff like that too. So, it's people with different backgrounds you can learn from. It's really cool.
It's wonderful. So I want to ask a question, which is, maybe I'm wrong about it, but pharmaceutical CVCs, let's start with normal companies, corporations, they have this kind of distribution law type of outcomes. Most of the outcomes will be good, very few bad, very few very good. Pharmaceutical is a power law. Most of the research will not pan out, but some will be exceptional outcome, which means that the power law that CVCs need to understand is already understood by the mothership. That's my assumption. Could you speak to how much of that is true, and is it helpful or not for you to create a CVC that can really perform and bring value?
So the knowledge of success and failure rates in drug development are extremely well known. Meaning, if you it has changed a bit, but only 10% of drugs that are first put into humans end up making it. So your failure rate is great.
No.
But the one thing that you have to take into consideration, it still takes 10 to 15 years to develop a drug. And the venture capital investment function is at the front end. It is not, you're not around when that drug is successful or failure, to be quite truthful. So I like to think about that aspect of how the success, and we can go back into individual, my rule of 10. But the way I view venture capital investing in the biotech space is a relay race, right? Where you've got a baton that gets passed to 4 different people. And as you well know, you can have the record-breaking time, in one segment and still lose the race, right? So we can have, and the venture capitalists, one of the benefits in the biotech space is we're usually gone before the determination of the drug's ultimate success in the commercial market, because that's too long, that's too far away, depending upon when you invest in things. And you can have a company and a drug in that company that looks great for 5 years or 4 years, and means if you're going public, then your stock is going up and you can exit in the public markets by selling your stock and making money on your investment. And then lo and behold, when they run that phase 2B trial, it fails. And then the stock in that company goes down, but you've already sold because you were an early investor. So you need to manage your exits, in sort of a time-based fashion. But we are never there when you determine whether the product is successful commercially or not. For the most part, we're not there. So we are the first baton runners in the race that it takes to bring a drug to market. You pass the financial risk of developing a drug, along with the baton. Consider the baton the product, but the financial risk gets passed along to it. You may pass it along to a pharmaceutical company if you sell the company you've started to another pharmaceutical company, could be Pfizer or somebody else. You may pass it along to private equity guys, when they get happy about biotech, which depends upon only in bull markets, or you may pass it on to the public markets, in a bull market, et cetera, too. And then it gets passed on again, in terms of, is this a growth stock, is this going to be merged later, et cetera, is that little company going to get bought in the public markets, et cetera. So you pass the financial backing of these companies on to different players over time, and you pass the financial risk onto these players over time. Each step along the way, you should be reducing the risk. Let's put it that way. And that's why venture capital is the highest risk type investments you make. Now let's talk about making 10 investments and I'm sure it's true in every, it's the portfolio approach. So you make 10 investments, you're going to lose every penny you put into 4 of them. It's going to go away. Failure, people, product, whatever. You're going to lose that money. That's a given when you make these 10 investments. The next middle, say 3 to 4, you'll get your money back. You may get a 2x, twice your money back. Maybe get you twice your money back. But the way the venture capital works is 2 of them are going to be big winners. And they're going to pay for the failures the lack of phenomenal success for the middle range of them, and they're going to pay for the ultimate success of a 10 company portfolio. So the good ones pay for the bad ones. But everybody in venture capital, well, every investment we make, we're sure it's going to be successful. We're sure it's going to make money. We're sure our parent organization is going to be interested in it going into the investment. But times change things, and that's not always the case. And so you have to have a portfolio, and you don't want a portfolio of things that are all in the same space. You want a bit of a broad portfolio. I mean, I don't want to do hardware investing and biotech, but I want to not have all my eggs in neuroscience, or all my eggs even in oncology, or I like a few tools, and, I like a few tools that are used in tool investments because they're shorter term, they don't take as much money, et cetera. And so I like a little bit of a mix in the type of investing that we do. Corporations will help you determine what investing they want you to do. It's really interesting in the corporate venture capital world that there have been situations, and they may exist to this day, where the parent says, I want you to invest in areas that we're not working in because we're not working in them. And those areas are nascent and new and emerging, and we want you to track them and be on top of them too. Or you can have a group that says, I only want you to invest in what I'm doing. I only, like I'm in oncology and I'm in inflammation, and I want you to invest in those areas and forget about everything else. That's the very focused, and so your corporate environment changes, how you make that diversified portfolio.
Yes.
When it comes down to it. And we use, I think I mentioned, we do a little bit of fund investing. Those are for very unique reasons, like tools for manufacturing technologies, which is not, it's like life science, industrial type tools, those sorts of things, or material science, et cetera. Sometimes a geographic focus in the globe, from that perspective, or sometimes somebody who's got access to a lot of very early stage companies. So there's a very unique way we choose to do fund investing as a corporate group. Some corporations only do fund investing. Some corporations like to invest in funds that do the exact same thing that they do. For the most part, my co-investors are the ones who are like the big biotech in private funds that are investors. There are co-investors. They're not necessarily the group that we as the venture capital group choose to put money into. The corporation may put money into them.
Yep.
The corporation has different avenues for deploying their capital, and they probably should use different tools. You look at everything a corporation does, they have different tools that they use under different circumstances. And venture capital meets some of those needs, but not all of them. So it's only one of the tools that you use to interact externally with the entrepreneurial, innovative external environment. And we all know that we don't have a lock on all the innovation which is going on inside our companies. And that's why corporate venturing has become so popular. I started 30 years ago. There were not a lot of corporates involved in venture capital, to be quite truthful. And since then, pretty much everybody has a corporate venture capital arm. And I would say if you're dependent upon external innovation, and we all are, especially since technology drives a lot of what we do, yes, it makes a lot of sense to keep track of those sorts of things. And run properly, it shouldn't cost you anything, meaning that the returns that the group can bring back to the corporation should be greater than your cost of capital. So
absolutely,
my floor in terms of return is get your money back, get approximately a 10% cost of capital, and then you're making profits for the organization. And it's out of those profits that you should be able to run your team and pay for your team. It should be paying for itself. Now, that won't happen overnight. That takes 5, 6, 7, 8 years to get to that point. But once you get to that point, you should be making enough money for the corporation, and they love the profits. And unless you're evergreen, and we're not evergreen, it all goes back to the corporation. But that should be enough money to cover all of your expenses. We're a small group. There's 7 of us, et cetera. But it would actually cover the expenses for a much larger group, because to be quite truthful, we've had a team which has been highly successful over time. And we have a very good financial return to the corporation, so that we keep a lot of people happy as a consequence of that,
Yep.
I wish we had more collaborations with the companies in our portfolio, with our R&D organization, but sometimes our interests diverge in the time frame that we're an investor. We make the investment at the time that the parent organization is interested in it, and then by the time it matures, the parent organization is no longer interested in it. Okay, we're going to manage this company purely for a financial return. And I think you need to keep that in mind, because I think there's no reason to keep a corporate venture capital group around who's losing money all the time, like that's, then don't do it. There's other ways to invest your money. But
you could even argue that financial performance is a proxy of the strategic value. Yeah. And so if they are losing money, they're probably not picking the winners, therefore not the strategic value you seek in the first place.
So, I always get asked, okay, you're a strategic. Are you strategic or financial? And I say yes, both. Because you want to make sure you make investments that are strategic to the outlines that we operate in within Pfizer, which is different than other groups may operate, but our strategic decisions are made in a certain way. It's what we're working on, to be quite truthful. In our areas of interest, Pfizer's strategic areas of interest, in companies that also have the capability of making money. If there's a great company in there, and we don't think for some reason, family-run business or something like that, that it's going to have the ability to make money from that perspective, we'll say no. Corporation, do a business development deal there. Not for a venture investment. So we always keep in mind both the ability to make money as well as the ability to have strategic investments to the corporation. We are a corporation, and all of our money comes from the corporation. So I will say, yeah, every now and then we lower the bar in order to do something for the corporation when it makes sense. But we do not want to be throwing money away. We always want to keep a financial view in mind, as every corporation, no matter what your business should be doing.
This is such a golden nugget, explained so well. We're at the top of the hour, but I still want to ask one question because it would feel really bad for someone who has 30 years experience of corporate venturing not to ask you, what's your hope, especially as we professionalize even more the corporate venturing and we get the organization of GCV who introduced us, what's your hope for corporate venturing in the next 30 years? Or even 10 years? Maybe 30 years is too much, but the next 10 years, what could we do better for helping out on corporate venturing?
So I think that we should help to, I will say it's been happening over time in that venture capital has become a part of most corporations. However, when there is a management change or when there is a merger, one of the areas that suffers probably the most is the venture capital group, in that somebody decides to change the objectives, which throws a lot out the window. Somebody says, I don't believe in it, I don't want it, etc. I would hope that in the next 10 years, we create a much more stable environment internally in everybody's corporation, such that these groups that are usually small, they are not the tail that wags the dog, etc. They are very small, but very powerful, should be independent and financial, in their way to operate. That they don't suffer as much through the major corporate changes that occur. For example, you have many times corporations which need to save money and they're having across the board cuts, and large organizations are taking 10% haircuts. Well, if you're a group of 5 and you have to take a 10% haircut, you're going to lose a person, and you have to take those things into consideration. The other thing is I think corporations should gain a lot more value out of the members of their venture capital team, because we have a different perspective on things. We have a different approach on things. And I would say that they would become known better in their organizations. Many times they are sort of off in left field, too. I will say the one thing that I think that I could have done better in the years that I've been involved was more internal PR for my group, whether it was in my first fund that I was with, or whether in the Pfizer organization. And that's a little bit of a balance. You don't want to be super on everybody's radar screen, and sometimes you want to fly under the clouds, when it comes down to it. But I think that people need the continual education, and I would hope in 10 years that the understanding of what and how your corporate groups work, it becomes much more prevalent in your organization, so you can see what it can do for you as well as its limitations. It's not the be all and end all. It's not going to solve all your problems. But what you should expect of it. So I think it's increasing the knowledge of the corporate venture world, from that perspective, because we're all so different. I was just at the meeting last week, and it's like, oh, we can't sit on boards. Private companies, risk, indemnified at the company, indemnified at your parent organization. How much risk is there? But that's very different if you're like, we had a discussion, if you're Microsoft and you're one of the biggest buyers of a lot of tech companies and you have similar products. That's a little too close. I can understand that. Well, we co-invest with all of the other pharma companies because we don't know who's going to win, and if one of us wins, then all of us win, ultimately, and then we use the money that we make in the transaction and go back and invest in more good things for our parent organization. So I would just hope the understanding and knowledge of corporate venturing becomes much more widespread in our parent organization, such that they can be ultimately used to the maximum benefit of the corporation.
Well, Barbara, I think you are helping with this interview by sharing all your best practices and insights of 30 years of corporate venturing. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I very, very much enjoyed talking with you and sharing my knowledge and learning something in the process too. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So I'm going to stop the stream, which is